welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the PACtrospective, the Why. And this week we are talking with Claire Moyer, who's the Associate Director and Literary Manager of Inishnuit Theater Company. But we're talking to her particularly about our production of Mary Rose by J.M. Barrie that was part of the Fringe Festival in 2018. So, hey, Claire.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. At home.
Sure. So Claire, thanks for joining us on this crazy little thing we're calling the PACtrospective. And you're part of the one that we're calling the Why. So my first question is, why Mary Rose?
Sure. So you and I had a conversation, I guess about 3 years ago now, about a reading for PAC. And you left it pretty open, which was really exciting. And I started doing some research into kind of turn of the century, 19th to 20th century theater, because it was a really prolific time for theater. And we don't currently produce a lot of it, or we produce very specific shows or playwrights from that era. And I knew J.M. Barrie, who wrote Mary Rose, and of course is most famous for writing Peter Pan, was a prolific playwright at that time. And so I started doing a little research on him and found a description of Mary Rose as a darker, more adult version of Peter Pan. And that really piqued my interest. And I found a copy of it and I read it, and I was really particularly blown away by the stage directions, which is a strange thing. But they were really like full and evocative and mysterious, and it kind of took the edge off the style of theater that I think of as being a little bit stuffy from that era, a lot of family dramas and parlors, and it made it so much more complicated and strange and gave you so much more depth into these characters that it sort of chipped away at that kind of preconceived sense I had of these sort of plays and really opened the play up for me. And in a lot of ways, it has a lot of the themes we know from Peter Pan. It's about familial love, especially like parental love. It's about the need of children for parents, or that like tangible love of an adult. And it's also about death. And I think part of what makes Barrie such a brilliant writer is he never says it's about death. He says it's about magic, but we all know it's about death, and it's about losing someone at a really young age, and the fact that that kind of experience has no sense to it, as much as you may try to find sense to it. And I think it's easy with older plays to be like, these truths are universal, but I really think that is the beauty of this play, right? It's deeply human. It's very true. And if you sort of can take the sort of patina off of this, like the corsets and a little bit of the language, and understand these people as being very much the same kind of humans that we are today, it is worth doing, essentially. And one of the things I found really fascinating about the play is that it's one of Barrie's later plays, and he wrote it over a number of years, but ended up having it first produced right after World War I, when there was this sort of lost generation, particularly of young people. And the play was a huge success because it gave voice to this sense of loss, this sense of people aging beyond these young people. And there's a big thing in the play of how, when we lose someone, especially at a young age, our lives continue. And they are forever preserved as a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old, and we move past that. And so it's just one of those plays that hits on this really sort of delicate, sensitive thing in a way that I really admired how Barrie did that, and it felt like, that still made sense today.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Because nowadays we only really know J.M. Barrie from Peter Pan. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting how similar the plays are, and yet so different. So like when you talk about, how dark, how the themes are the same as Peter Pan, but that they're deeper and darker. that really resonated with me watching both the reading and watching the full production, and I think with the cast as well. So because it's such a weird, it's such a, well, I say weird, but it's a wonderful play
It
at the
is. It's
same time.
strange though.
Yeah. So, and because it's from a time period that, you know, as actors, we don't really get the chance to work on this kind of material that much. So was there a specific way that you worked with Emily Johnson, who played Mary Rose, and the rest of the cast?
Um, I don't know that it was different than any other play. In that sort of like the structure of our process. Emily and I had worked together previously on a one-person show, so we knew each other very well as artists. We'd spent a very concentrated period of time together a few years earlier. And it was a particularly brilliant group of people. Like, you know, you hope with every show you do that you're going to get people who are like game and collaborative, and this was just all those things and more. I think the biggest thing was making sure we didn't get caught in like being overly like like the mannerisms or projecting onto it, right? So we didn't want to suddenly make these really modern people. The story isn't modern. The relationships are, you know, that she's a young woman, she's getting married at 18, and while they think she's a little bit young, it's still perfectly legitimate, whereas nowadays we might not feel that way. So there are these things within it that are very much of the era, but to remember that, you know, this is a story about a family in the same way that any story about a family would be. And one of the things I think Barry does really beautifully is kind of subvert some of those assumptions. There's a lot of married couples in the show. Her parents, Mary Rose gets married. We see her relationship grow. And there's a constant undercutting of this idea of like the man is the man of the house, and they're like yeah okay, and so I feel like Barry gives us permission to kind of make it a little less held. And even though these people are in these, you know, they're buttoned up in their costumes, that and they may not be expressing their feelings in the way that we do today, those feelings are still there. And I think that rawness kind of grows over the course of the play. So it starts in this like slightly more proper world, and as these events happen to this family and they suffer these traumas, they become less and less kind of held in that way, or they look to those sort of social mores as a crutch, because the feelings they have are so overwhelming and life-changing. We did do some dialect work because it takes place in England, and we had a Scottish dialect and an Australian dialect, which one of the actors, Chase Bird, led and did beautiful work with. And you know, there were some things in the play that we edited a little. There was a character that we took out, and I know you were involved in that decision, just because he was there for jokes, and they're jokes that kind of aren't that funny 100 years on. And it helped us focus a little bit more in on the family drama. And there's still jokes in the play, they just made a little bit more sense.
Sure, but in 1920, that Gainsborough versus Turner, that
yes,
killed.
it was literally jokes.
Oh,
Literally
that
jokes
killed.
about lithographs. So like, what are you gonna do? And there were a few little words we tweaked. And it was basically just things where like the language hasn't aged well. It was nothing that ever changed the story, but Barry was pretty fascinated with the idea of childhood. And then also in this era of like, it's not Victorian, but carrying over some of that Victorian sentimentality. There was just some text, like there were some ways that Mary Rose was referred to at times. We're like, oh, she's such a child. And you're like, she's 24, she's married, and she has a kid. So you know, those little things that felt a little uncomfortable or didn't make sense. It was like a word here and a word there. But I think those are the little tweaks that allow the core of the play to still be held and still be produced, without compromising it, by acknowledging that like this story still works. Sometimes the language doesn't, and that's because language changes really quickly and faster than like human experience, essentially.
So one of the things, of course, is that PAC is for the most part a site-specific theater company. So a big part of this show was that we did it at the Woodlands Mansion and Cemetery. Can you talk about how the mansion and the grounds of the cemetery became, in a way, another character for the show, or how you use the space?
Oh yeah, no, that was a lot of the fun of it. So the Woodlands, right, is a colonial home that was then used as a Victorian cemetery. The estate was turned into a Victorian cemetery, and is now open to the public, but also still used as a cemetery. And I actually live very close to it and go walking there on a regular basis because it's open to the public, and in a lot of ways serves almost as like a park now. But so you have at the heart of it this like 18th century house that was slowly added onto, surrounded by this cemetery that starts in like the 1840s. And it's just like oozes atmosphere. It's just so beautiful. And the fact that, so as this is a family drama, at the heart of it, we have this house. Um, and we were able to perform acts 1 and 3 in this house as if it were the living room of these characters. And then act 2, which takes place on a remote Scottish island, we went out into the cemetery and performed in this kind of like open field. I mean, it was just like an absolute gift to have that space because, you know, like I was saying earlier, it's a play about death, but it's a play that doesn't talk about death. But to have like outside every window you look at in that building, a mausoleum or a beautiful like aging gravestone just had that sort of like tinge of a reminder. We were able to have her when she sort of disappears. I realize I didn't actually explain the story at any point, but she disappears for 25 years and then comes back unaged. We were able to have her kind of disappear into the cemetery, and like you could put all the lights and all the, you know, set pieces you want on stage. The beauty of watching someone walk off into the dark among these like glowing white headstones is just beyond. And I think again, it's like it makes it a little bit more tangible. You're not watching people on this proscenium stage with this set that may be beautiful, but we know is constructed. You're literally walking into a home and seeing a floor that has wear and tear. And we had a working Victrola running, so you have this like scratchy, gorgeous, full music. And every once in a while, like things would line up perfectly. On opening night, we did get chased inside from a thunderstorm, but literally, like we started the second act, which was the sort of magic act, with, you know, this crack of thunder and lightning splitting the sky, and you're just like, nature is so much better than anything we could do. So yeah, and I mean, it came with a little bit of constraints too. It's a historic building, it's a historic space. You don't want to mess that up. But I think those just allowed us to kind of problem solve and be even more creative. We couldn't, in a theatrical space, we could have possibly like staged magical moments using special effects. We didn't have that. So we created this sort of narrator character that took those beautiful stage directions and was this kind of guide, but also at the same time clearly had some sort of magical side to her. It was pretty undefined, which I liked. And that was purely the creation of this production and of Anita Holland, who was the narrator and who was brilliant. So yeah, it was a real blessing to have that space.
So you mentioned like the one moment of when Mary Rose disappears into the darkness, and you know I loved the play, and I remember, like, you know, from the reading, you know, finishing the reading, and I'm pretty sure that, I don't know, I feel like I must have said to you, we're gonna do this, or pretty soon afterwards I must have said that, because it's just gorgeous. And even as I was putting together pictures that we're gonna see in the beginning, it just like it moved me, just like seeing the pictures again. And like I had a couple of moments that as I was watching the play that are just some of my favorite moments in theater, because it's just so heartbreaking. But was there a particular moment that was a favorite of yours, or a moment that as a director, you know, as they say, 90% of directing is the casting, and you just they do all the work. But like, did you find that there was a moment that had to be crafted, or I guess a moment that had to be crafted, or a moment that you feel was a favorite of yours watching, that you loved what this person was doing or these people doing?
I mean, I really loved this production on a lot of levels, and I've been thinking about it a little bit since you know, contacted me. And like, a lot of shows I look back on after the fact and I'm like, man, I should have done this, or I wish I'd changed this, or like, oh, I'm like happy with 75% of it, but and this is one where I look back and I'm like, I am like, this was the right people doing the right project at the right time in the right space. I think because it's an older play and I had a little, it gives you a little bit of free range to play with it and edit it. I enjoy that. I enjoy being able to kind of like interpret and go into the piece and really hone in on what I think it should be in 2018. When I think we did in 2018. But I think that the most challenging part was the end, because it happens incredibly quickly. This character disappears at the end of Act 2. We come back at Act 3 and we establish that she's been gone for 25 years. Her parents are aging. Her husband is like almost 50 now. And then in quick succession, we learn that she sort of reappeared. Not only she reappeared, but because it's, 19 whatever, the letter saying or the telegraph saying she's coming got there late. So she's literally showing up in the next 20 minutes. And then she shows up and we see her for almost a split second and then she leaves. And then we jump forward in time to this kind of framing device we have in the play of this Australian soldier taking a tour of this empty house. We learn the soldier is her grown son. So there's sort of two moments in that were really challenging. What is the moment where she re-enters? And it was just because there was almost like so little text, we just found silence in that moment. Like, what do you say? There is nothing to say. If someone you loved desperately reappeared 25 years later, and then they walk in the door and look exactly the same, like, it even just gives me chills to talk about it. Like, there is nothing to say. And so I think that was not, I knew very early on that we needed silence, but it was just like learning to trust that silence and understand what is happening in that silence for each of those characters. And kind of like letting the audience have that moment. Like, it was always really interesting watching the audience because I feel like that was the moment where people sort of broke, because there was just like watching her parents and her husband see her was just so heartbreaking and so like so delicate, right? Like the actors Sue and John and Adam were just like so tender with that. So that was really challenging, just because to wanting to do it right. And then the other part is at the very end. So the ghost of Mary Rose reappears, and she leaves, and she sort of reconnects with her son, who's a grown man, and you're never entirely certain that she understands what it is. The idea is that she's been haunting this house for another 25 years, looking for her baby, and she meets this adult man, and she can't quite understand who he is, but his being there and his like affection for her sort of like is her unfinished business, and so she leaves. And so you're trying to create this sense of like a ghost in a space where this actor is like 2 feet away from you, while also she has to leave somehow, but it's also like, these are real people. She can't just disappear. And so it was, again, one of those things where we just like went with the simplest option. We had a little bit of lighting around her when she entered that made it feel a little bit different. And it all just kind of came down to the reactions of the other actors, right? If they sell that this is beyond understanding, then we will believe it. And again, the tenderness and the gentleness of Chase and Emily in that scene was really like, the more they believe it, the more we believe it, even if we know that this is like that actress we just saw 5 minutes ago who is alive. So yeah, those I think were the scenes that took had this sort of delicacy to them. And then the other big challenge was sort of Act 2 as a whole, because there's this like comedic Scottish character. J.M. Barrie himself was Scottish. It's a really running theme in British theater at the time of like, oh, Scotland, where the like yokels are. And this was written for a London audience, so it's like full of those kind of jokes, with this Scottish character and Mary Rose and her husband. But also at the same time, you're leading up to this moment where she disappears forever. And you can't just have this character who's there for laughs, or laughs that don't necessarily transfer over because we're an American audience who don't know why these English people think the Scottish person is the way he is. And that is, again, a real testament to actor Desir Terrell, who like really made it, like found a lot of sarcasm in this guy and made him a really like in-depth character, and sort of laid the groundwork for the end of the scene and when we see him again later. I do think that transferring comedy into the modern era is much harder than transferring drama into the modern era, because the jokes are topical.
It was interesting because like I did feel like the comedy worked, because there was that thing of like, oh, here's the Scottish yokel, but then and you know, and Adam's character sort of treats him that way, and then Jazir's character totally subverts that, and also maybe because Barry was Scottish himself, that's like, actually I'm at university and I had to become a minister, and you know, and turns out that this guy is actually smarter than the Brits.
Oh, like by far, and like highly educated, and like, and he like clocks this couple from the second, but also at the same time where there's this sort of like back and forth happening with the two guys, Mary Rose like finds a lot of affection for this young man, and because she feels affection for him, like he's like has this little connection with her, it helps us lead up to the moment where she disappears at the end, and Cameron is genuinely concerned, right, and is genuinely worried about her, and he shows up later to be the person who bears the news back to the family, and he lays the groundwork of the magic of like, you may think you're rational people, but there's stuff in this world that we can't know, and like don't laugh in the face of it. And then we see that happen. Yeah, I think it's also like, it is a recognizable trope. I lived in the UK for a while, including in Scotland. I remember talking with a friend of mine who's Scottish about how like, if you want to show someone, like if you want to make fun of a person for being backwoods, you give them a Scottish accent. And I was like, oh, it's like what we do with Southerners. And like, having grown up in the South, I'm very aware of like the second we want to be like, oh, and it's just like these horrible stereotypes. And it's just, that whole section is such a pleasure to watch Barry like chip away at these stereotypes while still building the story at a really like smart paced way.
Well, Claire, thanks for spending some time with us and talking about this great production of Mary Rose. So here we are, and you know, we're all in our houses and apartments and stuff. And so what are you doing right now during this time to keep yourself, you know, engaged, fulfilled, or whatever?
Yeah, well, I actually have a day job, so that's been keeping me pretty busy. I work for a social services agency, so more than ever, social services are pretty necessary. So I do that a few days a week. And that's keeping me very busy. I do a lot of walks in West Philly, including to the Woodlands, which has been a real lifesaver because it's just been so beautiful this time of year. It's really, if anyone has not been, it is one of the gems of Philly, I think. It's so beautiful and atmospheric, and you can just take a wander. I know it sounds weird taking a wander through a cemetery, but it's really beautiful.
If I may say, I'm going to be talking with Emma Max from the Woodlands as well. So,
oh, amazing.
Yeah, so Emma's going to be talking about Woodlands and also, you know, about what they're doing now as well during this time.
That's so great. I mean, it is like teeming with people safely at a social distance. But like, you know, I think having that in Philly is such a, it's really nice. It makes a big difference. Yeah, so that's sort of been it, and obsessing over my cat, which makes me sound a little crazy, but we're spending a lot of quality time together. And yeah, you know, a lot of, binging TV shows. Have you watched The Repair Shop?
I haven't.
I recommend it. It's about fixing family heirlooms and sentimental pieces. It's an English reality show in which they literally do things like repair clocks and furniture so that people can keep the memories of their grandparents alive. And it is a beautiful thing.
I should ask my in-laws because they're Brits.
Yeah.
The BBC series, if they've seen it.
It's so sweet. Like, there is no tension to it. It is just people like having an emotional investment in something and then having it restored. It's really lovely.
Conversely, Charlotte and I are binging Ozark right now.
Oh, I got through like the first season and then it got too violent for me.
We finished. We're in second season right now, so it's like
Yeah.
it's definitely not some like lovely old people in Yorkshire fixing clocks.
No, I my stamina for drama I think is like lower every day. I'm like I just want to feel like a little bit warm and fuzzy.
Sure.
That's all I want.
Well, Claire, thanks again for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this PACtrospective. If you like what you see, down below, you're going to see a little button. We've got a Glickstein challenge. So David and Linda Glickstein are matching all increased and new donations up to $500. So if you like what you see, donate on that button right down there. And we'll see you tomorrow for another PACtrospective, and this one with Emma Max from the Woodlands. All right, thanks, everybody. And thank you, Claire.
Yeah.